Hi, I'm Princess Senate, conference producer at Technology Networks, and I am here to introduce our next talk. Heavy metals in processed baby food. Could regulators be doing more to ensure consumer safety? I am pleased to welcome Robert Thomas as your speaker. Rob is the principal scientist of Scientific Solutions, an educational consultancy for the trace metal community. He has worked in atomic spectroscopy for over 50 years and has written over 100 journal publications and authored 6 textbooks. Rob is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry and a chartered chemist. A warm welcome to you, Rob. Following the presentation, we will also have a Q&A session, and we welcome any questions that you may have. Please ask questions using the Q&A system to the right-hand side of the video player. And without further ado, I will now hand over to Rob to begin his presentation.
Okay, thank you, Princess, for that very kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. It's been 3 years since I last gave a talk for Technology Networks, so I'm very much looking forward to contributing to this online symposium today. The focus of my talk is on heavy metals in baby food, and in particular, what oversight would look like going forward in light of recent events where the US FDA has been criticized for not doing enough to hold baby food manufacturers accountable for high levels of heavy metals in their products. Let me dive straight in by giving you an overview of my talk. I'll kick off with a study by Consumer Reports in 2018, which highlighted high levels of heavy metals in processed baby foods and how it triggered a congressional subcommittee report where 7 food companies were investigated for having high levels of lead, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury in their baby foods. So first, I'll give a brief summary of the congressional report. I'll then give an overview of its main recommendations, including how the FDA responded to these findings with its Closer to Zero initiative. Next, I'll talk about what the FDA actually proposed to hold food producers accountable. I'll finish with a real-world scenario that questioned the FDA's capability to regulate the baby food industry. I'll then get out my crystal ball and try to predict where these regulations are heading, and in particular, what we have learned over the past few years about the challenges of the FDA and manufacturers of baby food being on the same page. Let's go back to the summer of 2018 when Consumer Report came out with a study which showed concerning levels of heavy metals in processed baby foods. The consumer magazine was so troubled by the data that it sent a letter to Scott Gottlieb, the FDA commissioner at the time, expressing their concerns about the lack of oversight. The letter is shown here, but one paragraph in particular in the red rectangle caught my eye. We are concerned that the FDA lacks adequate limits on heavy metals in children's food. With the agency's own data and the work of Consumer Reports and other public interest groups, it is critically important for the FDA to take additional steps to protect public health. We urge the FDA to set a goal of having no measurable amounts of cadmium, lead, mercury, and arsenic in children's food, and to use the most sensitive testing methods to determine the presence of those elements. The letter then listed a set of suggestion action items, with one of its key recommendations being that testing of foods on supermarket shelves was absolutely critical to ensure consumer safety. This set off a series of events over the next 2 years, which eventually led to a congressional subcommittee report in early 2021 reprimanding the FDA for neglecting their oversight responsibilities. So let's take a look at the main points outlined in the congressional report. In 2019, following the Consumer Report study, the congressional subcommittee requested internal documents and test results from 7 of the largest manufacturers of baby foods in the US. According to internal company documents and test results obtained, commercial baby foods were tainted with significant levels of toxic heavy metals, including lead, arsenic, cadmium, and mercury. These results show that levels were many times higher than allowed under existing guidelines of food products. Internal company correspondence also showed that these food companies allowed dangerously high levels of toxic heavy metals in their products, which were exceeding those limits. Let's take a more detailed look at the individual heavy metals mentioned in the report. Let's begin with arsenic, which was the only element which was actually regulated in baby foods in 2021. And that's mainly because rice is a very common constituent in baby food cereals. It is typically grown in flooded fields, and as a result, has high levels of arsenic associated with it because the water dissolves arsenic out of the soil, which in turn gets absorbed by the plant's root system. For that reason, infant cereals made from rice typically have higher levels than other processed baby foods. Anyway, most of the baby foods were 4 to 5 times higher than the FDA limits of 100 part per billion for inorganic arsenic in rice cereals, and significantly higher than the limit of 10 part per billion for bottled water. One sample was actually over 900 part per billion of arsenic. It's also worth pointing out why inorganic arsenic is so important. Arsenic exists in the highly toxic inorganic form, such as arsenic-3 and arsenic-5, and the relatively innocuous organic forms, such as dimethyl arsenic acid. If there is inorganic arsenic in the soil, it is typically metabolized and converted to the organic form by the plant, but this is not always the case. For this reason, inorganic arsenic is the form that is typically regulated because of its much higher toxicity. Let's move on to lead. Most baby foods showed levels of 10 to 50 part per billion lead in the samples tested. However, one producer had a sample over 800 part per billion, while another producer had 6 samples that showed over 200 part per billion. Note that the FDA at that time did not have a limit for lead in infant cereals, but had a limit of 100 part per billion for lead in candy, 50 part per billion in fruit juices, and 5 part per billion in bottled water. Here's cadmium. Many of the baby foods tested were in the range of 20 to 50 part per billion, but one was almost 600 part per billion. There is no FDA limit for cadmium in cereals, but typical levels in foods are around 20 part per billion, while the cadmium limit for bottled water is 5 part per billion. And finally, mercury. Only one baby food manufacturer responded for the request for information and reported a level of 10 ppb mercury in one sample. It's also important to point out that there is no regulated limit for mercury in baby food, although the FDA has set a limit of 2 part per billion for bottled water. To summarize, here's a table of data comparing the highest levels of heavy metal contaminants tested against current regulated limits in food in 2021. In this table, the second column in yellow is the FDA regulated or typical limit in food in part per billion. However, only inorganic arsenic in rice cereals was actually regulated at that time. The limits for lead are based on lead in candy and fruit juice, while the limit for cadmium is a typical value based on FDA studies. As mentioned previously, there is no regulated level for mercury in food. The third column in blue is the FDA limit for bottled water. The fourth column in green represents the highest values tested across all products of all 7 food manufacturers. And the final column in red is the factor difference between the highest values and the FDA maximum limit for bottled water. It can be clearly seen that these factors for most elements are significantly higher than the limits for bottled water. So what was the overall conclusion of the report? The report was very critical of the manufacturers and said their testing protocols were totally inadequate. In particular, manufacturers were free to test only raw materials and ingredients and not the final product on supermarket shelves. Many baby foods tested were higher in the finished baby food than the company estimated based on individual ingredient testing. For example, inorganic arsenic in particular was between 30 and 100% higher in the finished products across the 7 different producers. Many companies had their own QC limits, but failed to take any action if they were not met. And the final conclusion was that all baby foods should have warning labels about the dangers of heavy metals. So what did the report actually recommend? There were 5 major recommendations to the FDA, which are highlighted here. First, mandatory testing. The finished product should be tested for toxic heavy metals, not just their ingredients. Labeling. Levels of toxic heavy metals should be reported on food labels. Toxic ingredients should be phased out in a timely manner and substituted with ingredients that are lower in toxic heavy metals. Maximum limits. There should be maximum limits of toxic heavy metals permitted in baby foods. One level for each metal should apply across all baby foods, and the limit should be set to ensure protection against the impact of their toxicity. And finally, parental education. It was suggested to parents that they try to avoid baby foods, such as rice products, that contain ingredients high in toxic heavy metals. Instituting all these recommendations should give families the information they need to make informed decisions to protect their babies, which became the basis of a new congressional bill that would eventually become the Baby Food Safety Act in March 2021. The key directives of the bill, sponsored by 2 congressmen and 2 senators, is outlined in the next 2 slides. Set the maximum levels of heavy metals in baby food that manufacturers would have to meet within 1 year. Lower those levels further within 2 years. Require food manufacturers to test their final products, not just the ingredients. Require manufacturers to post the results of their product testing online twice per year. Establish a public awareness campaign through the CDC to highlight the risks posed by toxic heavy metals in baby food. And authorize $50 million for research on agricultural methods of reducing toxic heavy metals in crops. So how did the FDA respond to the 2021 Baby Food Safety Act? Its response was to implement an initiative called Closer to Zero, which aimed to reduce exposure to toxic elements in foods commonly eaten by young children to the lowest levels possible. The executive summary of the initiative outlined the following points. Although testing showed that children were not at an immediate health risk from exposure to toxic elements at the levels found in foods, the FDA will start to reduce levels of toxic elements in these foods over time. They recognize that American families want 0 toxic elements in the foods eaten by their children. However, in reality, because these elements occur naturally in the environment, there are limits to what can be achieved. The FDA's goal, therefore, was to reduce the levels of heavy metals in these foods to the greatest extent possible. They were also very sensitive to the fact that currently these levels are probably not feasible, and as a result could mean significant reductions in the availability of foods that many families rely on for their children. The plan outlined a multi-phase approach to achieve the goal of reducing levels of toxic elements in food to as close to 0 as possible in a timely manner. Here is a table of the proposed new heavy metal limits compared with the current regulated limits in food in 2021. In this table, the second column in yellow is the FDA regulated or typical limits in food in part per billion shown previously. The third and fourth columns in blue are the proposed limits recommended by the 2021 Baby Food Act for regular baby foods and rice cereals, which the FDA would have to meet within 1 year. The fifth and sixth columns in green and red are the FDA maximum contaminant limits for bottled water and drinking water, respectively. You've noticed I've included a value for typical value for mercury in canned tuna fish, mainly because it is the popular sandwich filling in the US, which is often enjoyed by young children. And we know mercury emissions are a byproduct of coal-fired power plants, which finds its way into the ocean, where it gets converted into methyl mercury by marine species and eventually finds its way up the food chain to large predator fish like tuna. So how did the FDA propose to implement the Closer to Zero initiatives? It proposed a 4-stage multi-phase approach as follows. First of all, evaluate the scientific basis for action levels. The FDA will evaluate existing data in the public domain to establish reference levels for certain toxic elements which are an assessment of a specific health risk. Propose limits. These will be the key factors that determine the development of the FDA proposed action levels for certain toxic elements in categories of food commonly eaten by young children. Consult with stakeholders. For each toxic element in every category of food, the FDA will gather data through a process of consultation with the scientific community to achieve the proposed action levels and the timeframes for reaching them. Finalize action levels. The FDA will use the information gathered from stakeholders, scientific research, and routine monitoring to make any needed adjustments to these action levels. Then once the FDA has published the final action levels, the agency will establish a timeline for assessing industry response towards meeting the action levels, and if needed, support scientific efforts to adjust the action levels downwards. So what is the status of the Closer to Zero initiative today? In January 2023, the FDA came out with new guidance specifically to lower the levels of lead in processed baby foods. Lead was initially chosen above the other heavy metals because there is a wealth of publicly available data on lead toxicity, and particular its impact on babies and young children, which has been linked to attention deficit disorder, behavior problems, and lower IQ. The guidelines would set action levels of 10 parts per billion for lead in fruits, most mixed vegetables and meats, grains, yogurts, custards, and puddings, and 20 parts per billion for dry cereals and single ingredient root vegetables such as carrots, sweet potatoes, and beets. It's also important to emphasize these action levels are not mandatory limits, but suggested guidelines. As a result, the FDA states that it may consider a food to be adulterated if it exceeds those levels, which could possibly lead the agency to take various enforcement actions. So this table represents a comparison of the 2021 Closer to Zero suggested guidelines for lead and the 2023 proposed limits. It can be seen that the Closer to Zero data in the blue row were 5 ppb for the majority of processed baby foods and 10 parts per billion in rice, cereals, and root vegetables, whereas the proposed limits in the yellow row are 10 ppb and 20 ppb respectively. The first thing you might notice is that the proposed limits for both food categories have been relaxed by a factor of 2, which suggests to me that the FDA was overambitious when the Closer to Zero levels were first published. So what has happened since the new proposed FDA action limits were published in early 2023? Well, there have been a couple of events, I believe, that are noteworthy. First, Consumer Report came up with a new study of heavy metals in baby foods in June 2023. They retested 7 baby foods that had concerning levels in their 2018 study. For 3 of those products, many of the heavy metals declined slightly, but for 3 others, the heavy metals increased quite considerably, while one of the foods remained the same. However, the overall conclusion of the study was the industry still has a long way to go. In some of the products, the reduction of certain heavy metals were offset by increases in others. So there was very little change in the amount of foods that babies could eat. And they still found high levels of foods that their 2018 tests showed to be most troubling, namely rice and the root vegetables, sweet potatoes, and carrots. The other thing that happened was definitely more troubling. In November 2023, there were reports of children getting sick from eating cinnamon applesauce pouches. On further investigation by the FDA and the CDC, the children were found to have elevated blood lead levels indicating potential lead toxicity. Over the next 6 months, the FDA carried out a comprehensive investigation which identified the pouches were manufactured in South America had been made with adulterated cinnamon from one cinnamon producer in Ecuador. Let's take a look at the main findings of the investigation. They found the cinnamon had been contaminated with lead chromate to enhance its color to make it more attractive to sell, a classic example of using economic adulteration for financial gain. On further investigation, they found the cinnamon contained around 5,100 parts per million of lead, together with 1,200 parts per million of chromium, which was consistent with the ratio of lead and chromium in lead chromate. the lead level was actually more than 2,000 times the limit of 2.5 ppm being proposed for bark spices by the World Health Organization. In addition, the results for one of the recalled applesauce products had a lead concentration of 2.2 ppm, which is more than 200 times greater than the actual level of 10 ppb that the FDA had proposed in its draft guidance for fruit purees. However, they did not present any detailed information on the levels of chromium, mainly because there's not much known about the health impact of chromium in the public domain. Chromium is a naturally occurring element, which is an essential trace nutrient important to the diet. Chromium exists predominantly in two forms, chromium-3 and chromium-6. Chromium-3 is a nutritional form, but can be toxic at elevated levels. However, chromium-6 is a more toxic form and is a byproduct of many industrial processes. Unfortunately, we know that lead chromate is a source of hexavalent chromium, but we do not know how the production of cinnamon applesauce impacts the chromium-6 and whether some of it is converted to chromium-3. However, the FDA said it didn't have the analytical capability at that time to determine what species of chromium was present in the cinnamon applesauce pouches, so it did not carry out any further testing to confirm the presence of hexavalent chromium. By the end of the investigation, 519 children in 44 states have been confirmed by the CDC as having blood levels of 3.5 microgram per deciliter or higher, sampled via a finger stick within 3 months after consuming a recalled product. To put this in perspective, what does that actually mean? This table, taken from the CDC website, shows the different ranges of blood lead levels of concern together with the required action. It can be seen that blood levels in excess of 3.5 microgram per deciliter, the child should be retested with a venous draw and not a finger stick. And then it becomes more of a concern if the child has levels above 5 microgram per deciliter, when the local Department of Health gets called in. However, it should be emphasized that they did not indicate if any children had significantly higher blood levels, only that they were above 3.5 microgram per deciliter. If we jump to the top of the range in this table, we see a value of above 45 microgram per deciliter is considered extremely high and requires hospitalization for chelation therapy to remove lead from the child's bloodstream. It's also worth pointing out in the 1960s, before sensitive instrumental techniques were available, 45 microgram per deciliter was a threshold value because it was the measurement limit of quantitation, so it was considered a normal value for the US population. But at that time, lead was everywhere in our lives, including lead paint, lead gasoline, lead water pipes. So there's no question there's instrumental techniques like ICP-MS have allowed us to reduce the threshold level down to 3.5 microgram per deciliter over the past 60 years. And let's not forget, earlier this year was the 10th anniversary of the Flint, Michigan drinking water crisis, where lead pipes contaminated the water supply. We are still seeing repercussions of this 10 years later, where many of the people in Flint are still using bottled water. And for those of you who are not familiar with the microgram per deciliter units, 1 microgram per deciliter is equal to 10 parts per billion. Levels of chromium were not a part of the investigation, so were not measured. However, the FDA warned that lead chromate is a source of hexavalent chromium, which is highly toxic compared to trivalent chromium, and suggested consulting with your physician for further guidance. So what was the outcome of this investigation? All contaminated product brands mentioned here were recalled in the US and taken off retailer shelves. However, the FDA warned that they have a long shelf life, so consumers should check their pantries and discard any recalled products. They also cautioned that they have limited authority over foreign ingredient suppliers who do not directly ship product to the US. This is because their food undergoes further manufacturing process prior to export. Thus, the FDA has limited ability to take direct action with the supplier of cinnamon or the processor of the cinnamon sticks. So the current update as of May 2024, the FDA has transitioned from its initial response activities to contain the event so that no additional illnesses occurred, and to identify the source of the issue. The agency is now focused on post-incident response actions, which includes additional surveillance, as well as prevention and compliance activities. Further updates on lead-related actions and activities can be found on the FDA post-incident website, which is shown here. However, something very positive has come out of this incident. Last month, a group of senators and representatives sponsored a new bill called the 2024 Baby Food Safety Act, which hopes to address many of the gaps and limitations in the 2021 Act. At a recent Senate hearing, the FDA Commissioner, Dr. Robert Califf, asked Congress for more authority to oversee all food manufacturers, not just baby food producers, using a model that's similar to how it oversees pharmaceutical manufacturers. He went on to say that in most of the regulatory oversight, the first line of defense is the industry that they regulate. So similar to the production of medicines, they don't test every lot, but the company that manufactures the drug is required to do it and have the records available for the FDA to inspect. He would like to see the same thing happen with regard to all critical food products, particularly the ones consumed by young children. He would also like a new authority from Congress to require that food producers report contamination they find in critical foods such as infant formula or processed baby foods and conduct more frequent monitoring of manufacturing facilities. So what is there to learn from all this? Clearly, there's a lot of pressure being put on food manufacturers to carry out their own testing and not relying on the FDA to regulate the problem. It will be interesting to see if this really works, because here we are 6 years later after the first Consumer Report study and the congressional investigation, and 3 years after the first Baby Food Act, there has been very little progress. And even today, the new FDA maximum levels for lead are suggested guidelines and not regulated limits. So it still remains to be seen going forward whether food manufacturers and the FDA can ever be on the same page, because there could be further adulterated cinnamon applesauce crisis or equivalent around the corner. We truly hope not, but only time will tell. And to finish up, if you want to read more about this topic, I wrote an article for my Atomic Perspectives column in Spectroscopy magazine in July 2021. It does not include the most recent information, but it does discuss the most important issues with regard to heavy metals in baby foods. The link to the article is given here. And you might also be interested in this article I wrote for International LabMate this year on the link between lead toxicity and human disease and the role of atomic spectroscopy techniques in lowering the CDC blood level threshold levels. And finally, if you're interested in knowing more about the measurement of heavy metals in a variety of consumer products using ICP-MS, I encourage you to check out 3 of my books shown here. The most recent one is on the left, which is Practical Guide to ICP-MS and Other Instrumental Techniques. And finally, I'd like to mention my LinkedIn group, which is focused on the impact of metal toxicity on human health. It's been going for 4 years and currently has 533 members. So if you're interested, I encourage you to sign up and contribute to this very important discussion topic. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I'll gladly answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you again, Rob, for that incredibly informative talk about heavy metals in food. We have received some questions online already, so let's jump right into your Q&A. So for your first question, why do you think food manufacturers only test the raw materials and ingredients and not the final product?
I would say it's mainly because of cost. It's very expensive to test all your final products, particularly all the ones on supermarket shelves. So I would say that they do a fairly good job of testing ingredients, but it becomes cost prohibitive to test final ingredients. And, you know, you can argue that baby foods are not different to any other food. The food manufacturers will only test if there is a problem, and they rely on the food manufacturing process to be diligent and to catch any problems with the manufacturing process. But I know, based on my experience, that I've published other material which has shown there is similar levels of heavy metals in other foods, particularly spices. There's heavy metals in spices. I wrote a study a few years ago on heavy metals in cat and dog food, and some of the cat and dog food was quite high in heavy metals. And there have been other independent other independent inquiries in the public domain, which has shown that there are heavy metals in finished food products on supermarket shelves. So I would say that it's a cost issue, and unless a consumer advocate group finds something untowards, they do rarely test the finished product. But I think what Congress is doing now, and certainly what the FDA is suggesting, is because there are been a number of issues, particularly the two consumer report studies, has shown that just testing raw materials is not good enough. They need to start looking at testing finished products, and I think until that happens, I think there's always a potential crisis around the corner. I mean, I hope not, but I think potentially it's always going to be the case.
And following up on testing, Rob, do you think transparency through labeling or online results would be a feasible solution for consumers?
Well, producers have never put warning labels on their final products about heavy metals. I think they don't want to alarm families. They don't want to, alarm their customers. And if they tested high levels of heavy metals in their products, would they put it on food labels? I find it very hard to believe, although there's a definite push from Congress and from the FDA for them to do that. I just think that food producers would be hesitant to do that. One of the recommendations was to post information on their website twice a year. I mean, that might be something that they'd be willing to do. I mean, I don't know. Maybe there are some conscientious food producers out there that would be prepared to do it. I mean, particularly if the levels are not, not particularly high. I think if they're within the suggested or regulated limits, they might be prepared to do it. But if they test it high in heavy metals, I think it's unlikely that they're going to post that information. I mean, that's my own opinion anyway.
Thank you. So I've heard that some elements can exist in different oxidation states in food. For example, how do you differentiate between inorganic and organic species of arsenic?
Yeah, that's a more complicated analysis. When you measure arsenic in anything by, say, by ICP-MS or graphite furnace, you're measuring total arsenic. And we know arsenic exists in inorganic arsenic-3 and arsenic-5 and organic arsenic. So that doesn't tell you the different species of arsenic. So you have to couple either HPLC or ion chromatography to your ICP-MS detection system to do the separation of the element. Not only arsenic, but other elements which exist in different forms, like chromium. So you have to put a chromatographic separation system at the front end, do the separation there, and then pass the separated species into the ICP-MS for detection. And the instrument doesn't know that they're different species. It's just measuring the element arsenic or chromium. But the problem with certain types of samples is you have to make sure that your sample preparation doesn't destroy the species. So with cinnamon apple sauce, for example, you can't use any processes which are going to destroy the species. So I think that's why the FDA didn't have the technology at that time to differentiate between the different chromium species, because they didn't have the technology. I think HPLC is available, but how does the sample preparation affect the different species? I think they were worried that they would destroy the species and they wouldn't be able to detect the difference between chromium-3 and chromium-6. I don't know. But it's a more complicated analysis, which requires a lot more operator expertise. But basically, it means putting a chromatographic separation system on the front end, separating your species and passing them into the ICP-MS for detection.
Yeah, so currently regulations focus on only a handful of heavy metals. So why do we only monitor for heavy metals? Isn't there the potential for other metals being present in foods as well?
Yes, absolutely. I think because the big four, lead, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury, have been traditionally known as the most toxic. So that's why they chose those. But we know for certain, and um, there's studies in the public domain in the open literature which suggest that there's other elements present in food products. And you got to understand that many food products are made from crops which are grown in the ground. And we have contaminated this planet the last couple of 100 years, ever since the Industrial Revolution. So we have contaminated a lot of the land, a lot of the soil. So inevitably, there's going to be a lot of absorption of any toxic metal in the soil or in the grow medium into the roots and into the plant. And it's inevitable it's going to get into the food product. And we also don't know how the manufacturing process impacts the toxic metals. So if you're using stainless steel, or if you're using dirty container system, there's a good chance that you could absorb some of the metals from the manufacturing process. And we know, because I do a lot of work in the cannabis testing space, that manufacturing cannabis consumer products not only has elements which are present in the soil or the grow medium, but we know the manufacturing process is quite dirty. The cannabis industry is not so diligent as the pharmaceutical industry, for example, of using high pure, clean materials. So we know, and I publish a lot of material which shows that cannabis consumer products are picking up contamination from materials used in the manufacturing process. And, that's the problem. And I think we need to start looking at more than the big four. But at this present moment in time, the food industry is focused on the big four. And, that's fine. I mean, actually, the FDA only came out with suggested guidelines for lead. So they didn't ignore the other three, but they chose lead because there's most information in the public domain, and we know how toxic lead is. But I published a lot of information on looking at up to 20 different elements in cannabis consumer products, and there's other researchers have done the same. So I think it's only a matter of time before we start looking at more than the big four, but at least the big four is a good start.
Thanks, Rob. Moving on to a real world example. So let's consider identifying contamination based on origin. So you mentioned earlier on in your presentation the lead in cinnamon apple pouches the pouches. Yeah. So do you think it would have been easier to uncover the lead in cinnamon applesauce pouches if it had been on a US-based food producer?
I kind of like to think so. I like to think. I mean, the FDA, will admit, because this was an imported product. Very little testing is done of imported products. And I'm not suggesting South America or Ecuador is an illicit market where they do that stuff, but certainly a lot more goes on overseas, which is out of control over the regulatory body. So I think when you have something like that going on, and you have something which is not uncommon, actually in the past, and it's in the public domain, one illicit manufacturer in Bangladesh used turmeric, which was adulterated with lead chromate. So again, that saw itself in turmeric pills, turmeric sort of dietary supplements, which are very common nowadays in the US. And they found out after a while, I'm not too sure how long, but they found out by testing that turmeric was actually contaminated with lead chromate. So we know that does happen, adulteration for economic gain. I'd like to think that the FDA would be more diligent to homegrown manufacturers, but I don't know. I can't confirm that, because at this present moment in time, there is still no testing or very little testing done on the final product. So, I like to think that it probably would catch it, but I'm not absolutely certain it would.
So parents are understandably concerned about heavy metals in baby food. How does baby food compare to other food products in regards to heavy metals? And are there some considerations that we should be taking in for minimizing risk?
Yeah, I actually touched upon this in my talk. I don't think I don't think baby foods are any clean or contaminated as any of the other food materials. I think we're concerned about it because these are foods that we feed to our babies and our young children, and lead in particular, because we know that young children with a developing brain and developing bodies find it more difficult to, you know, you can't ignore the impact of lead on young children and babies. At least with adults, we are, we're capable of dealing with it, a little better. And, that's not to say that we can do it well, but I think with lead in particular, also cadmium, arsenic, and mercury, but lead in particular, there's a lot of information in the open literature about the impact of lead on young children. But I think if we had a more rugged and a more robust testing protocol, I think we'd find a lot more regular foods would be as contaminated. And as I said, I published a little some information on pet food and one on spices, and these do contain, some of them contain quite high levels of heavy metals. So I think we're alarmed on baby food, and it's getting a lot of attention, particularly by Congress, and as a result, the FDA, is because we are very concerned about the developing brain of babies and young children.
Thank you so much, Rob. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today. Any questions that we didn't have time to get to will be sent to the speaker after the event. As with all the other talks in the event, this talk will now be available to view whenever you want for the next 30 days. That just leaves me to say thanks again, Rob, and we'll be back soon with the next talk.
Thank you very much, Princess. Enjoy the talk. Thanks.